In a prehistoric cave tens of thousands of years ago, there were no bedrooms, no doors, and no defined couples. Just a group of people lying close for warmth, comfort, and survival. A woman might cradle a baby that wasn't biologically hers. Nearby, two men might share food, shelter, and emotional connection with her without tension or jealousy. For early humans, relationships weren't built on exclusivity or ownership. They were shaped by the realities of living in small cooperative groups where everything, resources, labor, even affection, was shared. Recent research supports this. Studies in evolutionary anthropology suggest that early Homo sapiens, especially those in hunter-gatherer societies, didn't follow the strict rules of monogamy we often assume. Instead, partnerships were flexible, adaptive, and often non-exclusive. The book Sex at Dawn, by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jetha, proposes that prehistoric humans likely engaged in multi-partner relationships because doing so improved group cohesion and child survival. This wasn't free love in the modern sense. It was survival strategy. Emotional bonds formed naturally, and parenting was often communal. A child's well-being didn't depend on who their biological father was, but on the collective support of the group. In some tribal societies that still follow similar patterns today, like the Bari of Venezuela or the Trobrianders of Melanesia, multiple men may assume responsibility for the same child based on past sexual relationships with the mother. It's a system known as diffuse paternity. The takeaway: what we now call open relationships may not be a modern invention or cultural rebellion. They could be a return to something much older, a time when connection and cooperation mattered more than exclusivity. Despite what many people assume, early human relationships weren't disorganized or chaotic. In fact, they followed consistent patterns that supported the needs of the group. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers have found that these societies tend to prioritize group survival over individual possession, and that includes how they approached sex, parenting, and emotional bonds. Most early humans lived in small, tightly connected bands where cooperation was essential. Exclusive monogamous relationships, as we know them today, were rare. Instead, individuals often had multiple partners over the course of their lives. Some of these connections lasted only briefly. Others developed into more stable arrangements. But there were no rigid rules requiring exclusivity. In many of these communities, it was common for a woman to have children with more than one man across her lifetime. That didn't create confusion, it created flexibility, because everyone contributed to child rearing, and because social bonds were strong. This model reduced conflict rather than increasing it. The system worked because the goal wasn't personal ownership, it was group cohesion. One of the most misunderstood aspects of these societies is the role of women. Far from being passive participants, women often had significant autonomy in choosing who to partner with. In some traditional societies, like the Mosuo in China or the Trobrianders mentioned earlier, women control their sexual choices and decide when to begin or end a relationship. These decisions were made based on compatibility, trust, or emotional connection, not societal pressure. That didn't mean preferences didn't exist. Stronger emotional bonds naturally formed between some individuals. Some pairs would sleep together more often or raise children more closely. But none of this was enforced by law or ritual. It was a flexible system, shaped by shared needs and evolving emotions. In those ancient tribes, there were no marriage vows, no engraved rings, no concept of mine or yours. Yet there was trust. Bonds were formed not by contracts, but by presence. And among them, Women held power not just over life, but over love. In many early societies, it was women who chose their partners, who decided when to stay, when to move on. Far from being passive, they were active participants in shaping the emotional landscape of the group. Modern ethnographies of the Mosuo people in China or the Trobrianders of Melanesia still reflect this ancient autonomy. A woman's tent could welcome different men over the course of seasons, and yet within that openness, certain bonds deepened. Some pairs chose to sleep side by side for many nights. Some raised children together, not out of duty, but out of mutual care. This wasn't casual or careless. It was a different kind of loyalty. Anthropologists call it diffuse paternity when a woman bore a child. Every man she had been with might take part in raising it. Among the Bari of Venezuela, for example, multiple men may claim fatherhood of one child, offering food, protection, and time. Because in a world where the survival of the young depended on many hands, fatherhood was not a title, it was a role shared. This system wasn't built on jealousy, but on trust and distribution. Sex was not only pleasure or reproduction, it was a thread that wove people together, a bond that strengthened the tribe's fabric. And while some may feel tempted to label this as free love, the reality was more sacred. These were emotional agreements forged in silence, where fidelity was chosen, not demanded, and loyalty meant returning, not owning. Before society invented marriage, these people had already mastered belonging, even in a flexible system built on cooperation. Human emotions didn't always follow the group's logic. As relationships formed and repeated over time, certain emotional patterns began to emerge, especially the desire for closeness with one specific person. Imagine a man who had spent many nights with a woman in his group. They shared food, shelter, and even raised children together. But one night, she chose to lie beside someone else. He didn't say anything, didn't challenge her choice, but he felt something. A subtle, uncomfortable reaction that couldn't yet be named. It was the beginning of what we now recognize as jealousy. This feeling wasn't invented by modern society. It likely existed in some form among our earliest ancestors. And as emotional preferences became more frequent, the idea of wanting exclusivity, wanting one partner to yourself, began to take shape. In some cases, individuals started seeking longer-term bonds, not just because of affection, but because it made sense in the context of parenting and survival. Biologists and anthropologists suggest that this shift had an evolutionary component. For women, forming a stronger connection with a consistent partner could increase the chances of long-term support during pregnancy and child-rearing. For men, staying close to one partner could improve the chances of ensuring paternity and investing resources in their own genetic offspring. Of course, this didn't instantly eliminate open relationships. Many societies continued to practice flexible arrangements, but these new emotional layers, jealousy, rivalry, and the desire for individual recognition, added complexity. Relationships were no longer just about the group. They were starting to reflect deeper personal feelings and changing social dynamics. But even in this world of shared shelter and shared hearts, the human soul stirred with complexities it couldn't name. Imagine one man watching, quiet, as the woman he had held through countless cold nights curled beside another. The fire flickered, but something colder ignited inside him. Not rage, not rejection, something harder to define, an ache. A question: was she still his? Even if she was never truly his to begin with, long before monogamy was carved into culture. Jealousy had already taken root in the heart, and it wasn't only men who felt it. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, where parenting is still shared communally, researchers have observed women forming strong emotional preferences for certain partners. Even in systems of multiple fatherhood, the seeds of exclusivity, fragile and buried, had begun to grow. Evolutionary biologists suggest this shift was not just emotional, but strategic. For women, preferring a dependable partner could ensure long-term care for their children. For men, seeking consistent access to one partner might increase the chances of passing on their genes. These weren't conscious thoughts, but instincts blooming into patterns. And so, slowly, among certain tribes, longer-lasting pairs began to form not out of morality, but out of biological investment. But this new desire to claim, to secure, to possess created a tension with the old world of fluid love. Now, not everyone wanted to share. Not always. Not forever. And though these tribal unions remained open in practice, something invisible had begun to change: the quiet wish to be someone's only one. As early humans began to settle and cultivate land, everything changed: not just how they lived, but how they loved. For tens of thousands of years, no one owned anything, not the forest, not the fire, not even their partners. But around 10,000 years ago, when agriculture emerged in the Fertile Crescent, a new mindset began to form, one built on permanence, property, and inheritance. With farming came land ownership. With land came the need to pass it on. And for the first time in human history, knowing who fathered a child became economically important. If a man wanted to ensure his harvest, his livestock, or his tools would be inherited by his own offspring, he needed some kind of guarantee, certainty about paternity. This is where sexual exclusivity started to gain institutional value. In tribal systems, it didn't matter who the father was, children were raised by the community. But in an agrarian society, where land equaled wealth, the family unit became a legal and economic structure. Monogamy began to spread, not because it felt more natural, but because it offered social and financial stability. Over time, exclusivity became expectation. Fidelity, once a personal preference, turned into a cultural rule. Marriage wasn't initially about love, it was about lineage. And as this system took hold, women's reproductive choices became more closely controlled. Societies imposed new boundaries around their roles, behaviors, and freedom. In many early agricultural civilizations like ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, or later in Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian traditions, legal and religious codes formalized these expectations. Adultery became a punishable offense, often only when committed by women, because it threatened paternal certainty. The emotional openness of the past didn't disappear. It was repressed or pushed underground, but it left behind clues. Anthropologist Stephanie Kuntz points out that the earliest marriages were not built on romantic ideals, but on agreements about labor, inheritance, and property. The feelings came later sometimes. Even now, we're still living in the shadow of that shift. What started as a survival tool eventually redefined how most societies view commitment, fidelity, and love itself. Even after thousands of years of rules, contracts, and institutions, the basic human desire for connection, sometimes with more than one person, never really went away. While monogamy became the social default in many cultures, the idea of non-exclusive relationships kept resurfacing, often quietly, beneath the surface of mainstream norms. In some indigenous groups that weren't reshaped by organized religion or state control, older patterns of shared parenting and flexible partnerships survived. Among the Na people of China, for example, there is no formal marriage. Women can choose partners freely, and children are raised within the mother's household. Among the Bari of Venezuela, multiple men can share responsibility for one child based on past sexual relationships with the mother. These aren't fringe exceptions, they're living examples of how diverse human relationship systems have always been. Today, we have new words to describe old behaviors: consensual non-monogamy, CNM, open relationships, polyamory, relationship anarchy. These models are based on communication, agreement, and mutual respect, not secrecy or betrayal. They're often confused with cheating, but they're the opposite. In cheating, a boundary is broken. In CNM, boundaries are negotiated together. Recent surveys show a rising interest in these alternatives. A 2020 YouGov study found that about 23% of U.S. adults have engaged in some form of consensual non-monogamy. Among younger generations, the interest is even stronger. Psychologist Terry Conley and her team have found that people in open or polyamorous relationships report similar or even higher levels of satisfaction than those in monogamous ones when honesty and consent are present. What's important to understand is that this isn't about rejecting monogamy altogether. It's about recognizing that human relationships have never fit into just one box. The return of open models isn't a trend, it's a reflection of something much older. In many ways, we're not inventing new ways to love, we're remembering them. As societies grew more complex, controlling relationships became a way to control everything else: land, inheritance, power, and even belief. Love and sex were no longer just personal matters. They became public interests. Institutions like religion and law began to shape not only how people formed families, but what kinds of relationships were considered acceptable at all. The oldest legal codes in recorded history, like the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, didn't just manage property and crime. They also dictated what happened when someone broke sexual or marital expectations. These early laws were mostly written by and for men, and they often punished women more harshly than men for acts like adultery, because of the threat it posed to paternity certainty and inheritance. As religion gained influence, marriage was elevated from a social arrangement to a sacred duty. In early Christianity, for example, marriage gradually became associated with moral purity and eventually a religious sacrament. Over time, this merged with state power. In many cultures, the only legal relationships were heterosexual, monogamous marriages. Everything outside of that casual sex, same-sex relationships, multiple partners was branded immoral, sinful, or illegal. But while the structures changed, human behavior didn't. Throughout history, people found ways to connect outside the boundaries imposed on them, whether through extramarital affairs, hidden relationships, or informal emotional bonds. These weren't necessarily signs of betrayal. Often, they were attempts to express needs that the system didn't accommodate. Even today, research shows that monogamy isn't universal. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that family systems and marriage structures vary widely across human cultures, and that the Western idea of one lifelong partner is not a biological default. It's a cultural construct. And as psychologist Esther Perel points out, many modern couples are trying to meet all of their emotional, erotic, and spiritual needs in a single person. creating intense pressure and unrealistic expectations. The result is a growing disconnect. We live in societies shaped by centuries of tradition, but we carry instincts that evolved long before those traditions existed. And that tension between what we are taught to expect and what we actually feel continues to shape how we think about love, trust, and loyalty today. Even in societies that didn't practice strict monogamy, human emotions still existed. Early humans weren't emotionally detached or indifferent. They experienced desire, attachment, and yes, jealousy. But unlike in modern cultures, jealousy wasn't always treated as a crisis or a moral failure. It was seen as part of the emotional landscape, something to be navigated, not suppressed or punished. In small hunter-gatherer groups, people lived closely together. Everyone knew who slept with whom, who spent time with whom, and who bonded most deeply. Preferences naturally formed. Certain couples spent more time together. Some shared childcare. Others separated and reconnected later. These choices were fluid, and no formal rules dictated how long a relationship had to last or how exclusive it had to be. Anthropologist Sarah Hrdy, in her work on primate and human parenting, explains that early communities developed strong emotional bonds, but without the rigid expectations of ownership. In these settings, emotional needs were balanced against group harmony. If jealousy arose, it didn't necessarily lead to conflict. Instead, people adapted. Emotional discomfort was acknowledged, but not institutionalized into punishment or control. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, for example, men frequently share parenting responsibilities even in cases where paternity is uncertain. Yet they still form preferences. Some men express stronger attachment to one partner, and some women lean towards certain co-parents. But these preferences rarely lead to formal exclusivity or public rules. Instead, the system stays flexible enough to allow both closeness and autonomy. In these early systems, emotional loyalty didn't always mean sexual exclusivity. People could deeply care for one another while also acknowledging that relationships change over time. And that approach may explain why early human communities maintained social stability without needing marriage contracts, legal boundaries, or rigid definitions of infidelity. These insights challenge the idea that human nature requires monogamy. What they suggest instead is that humans have always had the capacity for complex emotions, and that we've used different social strategies throughout history to manage those emotions without controlling each other. For most of human history, relationships were fluid, adaptive, and deeply embedded in the survival needs of small communities. But as societies grew, emotions like affection, loyalty, and even jealousy began to be reshaped not by individuals, but by institutions. The shift didn't happen overnight, but as agriculture evolved into complex civilizations, love and family were no longer just emotional choices. They became part of a larger system that connected land, labor, and lineage. In this new model, relationships had to be predictable, traceable, and above all, controllable. Marriage began to take on a different function. It was no longer just a social bond. It became a legal contract. In ancient Rome, marriage determined citizenship and inheritance. In early Christian Europe, it was elevated to a sacrament. Across many cultures, marriage became the structure used to manage property, determine legitimacy of children, and define women's roles in society. This transformation also changed how emotions were treated. What had once been natural, like having multiple relationships over time, was now framed as deviant or immoral. societies began drawing sharp lines between fidelity and infidelity, loyalty and betrayal, love and sin. The goal was no longer to understand human feelings, it was to regulate them. But even under these systems, people continued to experience connection in ways that didn't always match the rules. In almost every historical period, there are records of people maintaining secondary relationships, engaging in discrete partnerships, or building emotional networks outside of their primary unions. These behaviors weren't necessarily signs of disrespect. They were signs that human needs are more complex than any institution can fully contain. Anthropologist Jack Goody observed that as marriage systems became more rigid, so did the effort to preserve them. Religions introduced vows, states introduced laws, families enforced reputations. But all of this was an attempt to control something fundamentally human: our need for intimacy, support, and connection, even when it doesn't follow a script. This part of the story reminds us that the rules surrounding love didn't come from nature, they came from history. And like all historical systems, they can be questioned, adapted, or expanded when they no longer serve how people actually live and feel. Despite all the rules, rituals, and institutions built around relationships, human emotions haven't evolved nearly as fast. Jealousy, desire for closeness, fear of loss, and longing for connection. These aren't modern problems. They're emotional instincts with deep evolutionary roots, shaped long before civilization existed. In early human groups, emotional attachments were expected to shift. People formed strong bonds, but they didn't always last forever. A partner might be with someone new one day and return the next. Emotional resilience and group-centered thinking helped maintain balance, but that didn't mean feelings were shallow. Archaeological findings like shared burial sites or cave art showing pairs of humans suggest that deep attachment and grief were very real, even in societies without formal monogamy. Fast forward to today, those same emotional instincts are still present, but now they're managed within strict social models. In monogamous cultures, romantic exclusivity is treated as both moral and emotional truth. But in practice, many people struggle with it not because they're flawed, but because the system doesn't always align with their internal wiring. Psychologist Helen Fisher has shown that human beings possess multiple overlapping emotional systems, one for sexual attraction, one for romantic love, and one for long-term bonding. These systems don't always activate at the same time, or with the same person. That's why it's possible to love one partner deeply while feeling attracted to someone else, or to feel loyal to a spouse while still craving emotional novelty. These contradictions aren't signs of failure. They're reflections of a species adapted to both flexibility and attachment. And when the modern world forces those instincts into a single structure, expecting one person to fulfill all roles, it creates strain. Esther Perel calls this the new emotional overload of modern love, where relationships are expected to provide everything that used to be spread across entire communities. Understanding this history helps explain why some people turn to relationship models like consensual non-monogamy, not to avoid commitment, but to distribute emotional needs more realistically. It's not about rejecting intimacy. It's about acknowledging how complex our feelings truly are. For most of human history, relationships were fluid, adaptive, and deeply embedded in the survival needs of small communities. But as societies grew, emotions like affection, loyalty, and even jealousy began to be reshaped not by individuals, but by institutions. The shift didn't happen overnight. But as agriculture evolved into complex civilizations, love and family were no longer just emotional choices. They became part of a larger system that connected land, labor, and lineage. In this new model, relationships had to be predictable, traceable, and above all controllable. Marriage began to take on a different function. It was no longer just a social bond. It became a legal contract. In ancient Rome, marriage determined citizenship and inheritance. In early Christian Europe, it was elevated to a sacrament. Across many cultures, marriage became the structure used to manage property, determine legitimacy of children, and define women's roles in society. This transformation also changed how emotions were treated. What had once been natural, like having multiple relationships over time, was now framed as deviant or immoral. Societies began drawing sharp lines between fidelity and infidelity, loyalty and betrayal, love and sin. The goal was no longer to understand human feelings, it was to regulate them. But even under these systems, people continued to experience connection in ways that didn't always match the rules. In almost every historical period, there are records of people maintaining secondary relationships, engaging in discrete partnerships, or building emotional networks outside of their primary unions. These behaviors weren't necessarily signs of disrespect. They were signs that human needs are more complex than any institution can fully contain. Anthropologist Jack Goody observed that as marriage systems became more rigid, so did the effort to preserve them. Religions introduced vows, states introduced laws, families enforced reputations. But all of this was an attempt to control something fundamentally human, our need for intimacy, support, and connection even when it doesn't follow a script. This part of the story reminds us that the rules surrounding love didn't come from nature, they came from history. And like all historical systems, they can be questioned, adapted, or expanded when they no longer serve how people actually live and feel. While monogamy became dominant across much of the world, it never fully replaced older systems. In fact, some cultures quietly preserved forms of open, communal, or flexible partnerships often misinterpreted by outsiders who viewed them through a Western moral lens. One striking example is the Na people of southwest China. In their society, there is no word for marriage, no formal cohabitation, and no expectation of monogamy. Relationships are formed through discreet nighttime visits, and children are raised in the mother's household with the help of her brothers. Paternity isn't denied, it simply isn't emphasized. The maternal line is the foundation of the family. Anthropologist Kai Hua, who studied the Na extensively, argues that their system works because it minimizes jealousy, avoids conflict over property, and maintains community stability. Similar patterns appear in parts of the Amazon, where some indigenous communities like the Canela or the Mehinaku have historically practiced systems of partial paternity. In these systems, a child can be considered to have more than one father, and all those involved contribute to the child's well-being. The focus is less on exclusivity and more on shared responsibility and social harmony. In Polynesia, historical accounts describe premarital and extramarital relationships as common and socially accepted, until missionary influence reshaped norms around sexuality and family structure. In Africa, certain groups, like the Nuer or the Maasai, have practiced polygynous or polyamorous arrangements that were not rooted in personal liberty, but in resource sharing and kinship strategy. In all of these cases, relationship structures evolved to match the economic, environmental, and social conditions of the culture, not abstract moral ideals. Yet when colonial forces imposed European models of marriage, these systems were often labeled primitive, immoral, or uncivilized. That judgment wasn't based on evidence, it was based on discomfort with difference. Modern anthropology has helped shift that perspective. Researchers like Sarah Hrdy, Helen Fisher, and David Graeber have shown that human relationships are incredibly diverse and always have been. What survives in these communities isn't just a different way to form families. It's a reminder that there was never only one way to love, raise children, or build trust. What's striking is that many of these non-monogamous cultures report lower rates of violent jealousy, domestic abuse, and breakdowns of family structure, partly because expectations are more flexible and communication more embedded in daily life. Their success challenges the assumption that monogamy is the most stable or moral path. In reality, it's simply the most legally protected in much of the modern world. Understanding these systems doesn't mean idealizing them. It means recognizing that relationship models should be evaluated on how well they support people, not on whether they fit a single template. Looking back over tens of thousands of years of human relationships, one thing becomes clear. There has never been just one way to love, connect, or build a family. What we often consider normal today, exclusive. Lifelong monogamy is not a universal blueprint. It's a relatively recent cultural adaptation, shaped by the rise of agriculture, private property, religion, and state power. For most of our existence, relationships were flexible. They shifted based on context, emotion, survival, and cooperation. People formed strong bonds, but they weren't always exclusive. They raised children together, but not always in pairs. And they navigated emotional complexity, jealousy, affection, desire, not through rigid rules, but through lived experience and shared understanding. The resurgence of interest in open relationships, polyamory, and other forms of consensual non-monogamy today is not a rejection of tradition. It's a recognition of human diversity. It reflects the idea that one model doesn't fit everyone, and that forcing all relationships into a single mold can create more harm than clarity. This doesn't mean monogamy is obsolete. For many people, it offers deep satisfaction, security, and commitment. But history suggests that it shouldn't be the only valid option. What matters more is how relationships are built with transparency, mutual respect, and adaptability. Whether a person chooses monogamy, polyamory, an open arrangement, or something entirely different, the core question is the same. Does this relationship reflect the values and emotional needs of the people in it? Understanding the deep past also helps reduce shame. Many people feel conflicted about their feelings, whether it's attraction to others while in a committed relationship, the desire for emotional novelty, or the struggle to meet every need through one person. These aren't personal failings. They're part of the human condition, part of how we evolved. By learning from history, anthropology, and psychology, we can approach relationships with more compassion and more honesty. Instead of pretending there's one right answer, we can start asking better questions. And that might be the most important lesson from the Stone Age to now. Relationships don't succeed because they follow a formula. They succeed when they're aligned with how people actually feel, communicate, and grow.